Thank you all for coming. This is 11:12 p.m. on the East Coast of the United States, and you are joining us at IllusionCon for Horror from Classic to Modern. I will be your moderator this evening. My name is Jacqueline Bryk. I am a freelance editor, developer, and designer and verber of things to do in the tabletop space, especially with horror gaming. And I will let my panelists introduce themselves, starting with Brandon, and then we'll go to Rina.
Hi, my name is Brandon Fischella. On YouTube, I am Brandon F. I'm a historian by trade. I primarily focus in the history of the military history, I should say, of the long 18th century. Although I do have a very keen interest on tabletop role-playing games. I've dabbled in a few, both DMing and playing myself. And so I like to think that I'll have a few interesting things to say for all of this, especially as relates to historical tropes and the role that they can serve in, both games that are set in historic environments as well as more modern settings that are attempting to sort of use, historical horror tropes. I mean, so many of them are. So, that's me.
Hi, I'm Rina Haenze. I am a role player and actual player. I focus primarily on horror gaming, though I've dabbled in other systems. Main systems are Call of Cthulhu, Cthulhu Dark, Vampire the Masquerade, and various and sundry other things with tentacles and teeth. And I do write quite a bit for Call of Cthulhu and Cthulhu Dark. You can find my stuff pretty much everywhere. I'm the head of Mythos for the Old Ways podcast, and I am a recurring player on Ain't Slayed Nobody. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about horror games. I've written some historical games, a lot of modern games. So my brain kind of goes into a bunch of different weird and wonderful places.
Hell yeah. So this is a fairly late panel, so we probably won't be going the full 2 hours, but this is a really fascinating topic, and I am interested to hear what our panelists have to think about it. So we're going to start with pretty straightforward question. What do you consider to be classic or historic horror? And what is important about that distinction to you? Either one of you can go
Rina,
first.
do you want to start us off?
You're the historian.
In tune with this world. Oh,
you're the historian, so you get to start off here. Yes, you do.
All right. So I think that when it comes to sorry, repeat the question for me one more time. I'm all nervous. I'm on a podcast.
What makes something classic horror to you, and is that distinction important to you?
So when it comes to a lot of the things that we always think of when it comes to horror, it all is rooted for the most part in like very Victorian, sort of late Georgian. A lot of it is historical in some way or another, right? And so I think one of the biggest things that makes something like properly, like classic, old school, if you will, is not so much like, oh, it's a vampire or it's old timey in some way, but it has to speak to, you might say, like what made it horrifying for people originally, right? Because I think that it's very easy to just, take a vampire, slap it on the cover and be like, oh, it's classic because vampires are old. It's like, well, I'm not sure that we can really say that Twilight, I haven't read it or seen it, so I could be entirely wrong on this. This is just my throwing out an idea there. But like, I don't think that we can really look at something like Twilight and say, oh, well, this is like a classic horror story. Well, just because it has an older element doesn't necessarily mean that, I don't think. Whereas I think that if you are attempting to speak to the same root issues, the same concerns, the same like things that made it horrifying to begin with, I think you're getting a little bit more into classic horror, as it were. That's sort of like where my mind immediately goes to that. Is it's a question of intention just as much, if not more so, as the actual like substance itself.
I'm going to push back just a little bit on that because Twilight is coming up on being considered vintage.
Oh God!
Well,
so
I suppose when I think of old, my time scale is a lot longer than.
Oh, that's fair.
But
how about you, Rina?
General.
I think I agree a lot with the idea that it has to speak to, when it comes to historic horror, has to speak to the horrors of the age. I think you can take even a more modern trope or more modern story and make it feel historic by dealing with some of those more classic tropes. You could take a robot, for example, and make it deal with some of the themes from the Victorian era. You could transplant it to that setting, or you could even do it in a more gothic setting now and give it the feel of that classic sort of historic horror, and it would still get that feel of being classic, of being horror. I don't think it has to do just with the monsters, just with this is what they wrote about at the time. It very much is that, what were they thinking about? What were they scared about? What were they writing about? What were the social mores of the era, especially the ones that were being subverted in the horror of the time?
Yeah. Well, and it's worth saying as well that like so many of those core issues are very much present and with us today, and that's
Mm-hmm.
what makes so many of those narratives, I'm sure we all agree, like so compelling, is the fact that we can relate with them so strongly.
Mm-hmm.
And so absolutely, like you said, it's like you can take, today it's a robot, yesterday it was an
Mm-hmm.
automata, before that it was Frankenstein monster.
Well, I think also, like, the idea is that we deal with a lot of similar things that worry us or scare us, but how we deal with them is very different. For example, you look at, like, the idea of sexual promiscuity being a horror, like Carmilla, the sexual, gorgeous vampire woman who's out seducing our ladies over here, and potentially causing sex all over the place, in Carmilla. And then you've got a similar sort of feel of fear of sexual promiscuity in 1980 slasher movies, but you're dealing it with a completely different approach, right? With a slasher versus a seductive villain, like a vampire kind of thing. So the tropes and the things that we're scared of might stay the same, but whether or not it's historic, I think, deals in how we approach it.
Oh my. Well, so first of all, when we talk about like the 18th century, I think it's a very, very broad time period
Mm-hmm.
for this sort of thing. Um, I think more often than not, when we hear stories about like historical, supernatural spoopums, as it were, that's prior to, like the 19th century, Victorian era and whatnot, it tends to be like, in the 17th century, in the 16th century, Puritans and witches and all that stuff, largely because by the mid to late 18th century, we're kind of like, as a world, or as a Western world, pulling out of those kinds of beliefs on a lot of, at least more high society levels, as it were, the Enlightenment and all that jazz, right? But that being said, there is still an awful lot, like, this stuff is still present, and for a very, very great deal, many people, they are living in a supernatural, a theological world where this stuff has a very real and a very direct impact. As far as like statistically what was the most common, I don't know that I can speak to that all too well, but some of the like immediate things that just sort of come to mind as far as like ghost stories that I've encountered like in my own readings of the time period. Obviously we have things like the Beast of Jovadon. We have the devil wolves in the woods in France that are killing people, and the army needs to be called out to put it down, and all sorts of delightful werewolf stories came out about that. We also have things like, the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It's a very late 18th century sort of spooky tale, although it's worthy of note that if you read through Sleepy Hollow, very, very tiny book. It's worthwhile to read through. But at the very end, spoiler alert, it's a couple hundred years old, but spoiler alert, at the very end, you have like the scary moment, but then there's basically a little paragraph long, or a couple pages long reveal where the author is like, and the town never heard from him again. But then, of course, he turned up another couple towns over. He was teaching over there. He's kind of a scumbag. He was fine. there's no ghost. Come on, guys, that's ridiculous. Don't be silly. Which is a very Enlightenment kind of way to end a horror story. I think it's like, no, it's all story. Don't relax. Don't worry about it. But as well, if you want like a good couple of examples of like average everyday people sort of encountering this stuff and thinking about it, like on a very core level, there are a number of soldiers' accounts from, in particular, the American War of Independence is what I largely focus on. So that's what I think of. In the memoirs of Joseph Plum Martin, for example, he's a sergeant in the Continental Army during the war. He recalls all sorts of interesting moments where, like, he's like out in the woods looking for food, and he's like half starved to death because, you know, oh, it's a great time going to war. He basically like passes out underneath a tree and has like these insanely vivid nightmares that he kind of like is trying to reconcile, like how much of that was like a real thing, how much not, as he's sort of like fading in and out of consciousness and whatnot. A really interesting account there. There's another of a British soldier. Was it? Oh, I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but there is an account of a British soldier who describes a number of very interesting ghost stories. One of which is, I believe he refers to it as old funk, which he describes as a ghost, which is sort of like, he actually describes it specifically as a poltergeist, which is haunting and sort of playing with all of the soldiers in a barracks building during winter quarter. Basically, during winter, the soldiers like aren't doing a lot, so they're just in their quarters, idle and trying not to get into too much trouble. And so this ghost would scare people by appearing in different forms. And one time, like a sentry came rushing in, white as a ghost, and saying, "I saw old funk, I saw." He appeared as like a small, pale child down the road, which is a very like modern, you can see that appearing like an early 2000s horror flick. It's like, it's a kid, that it's scary, right? But he could have sworn that it was a ghost that like was messing with him. There's another instance where the author himself swears that he views old funk as a ball of fire, as an orb of some sort that floats like wistfully through the woods, and it like, you know, was like staring at him or whatever. And there's another instance where a guy like could have sworn that he saw like the spirit of a pale dead horse that was half starved and like making horrible noises. It's a really like metal description, as I remember it, the way that he talks about it. But then ultimately with that, all the guys go out to investigate because they're like, oh man, there's like a devil horse, we got to go get it or something. And it turns out to just be like a pony that's looking for some food. There are so many examples, right? Reading through soldiers' memoirs of accounts of them seeing things like this that they don't like outright say are, you know, horrible, evil spirits and whatnot, but like they definitely leave off on that whole, yeah, I don't know what that was, and it kind of creeps me out to this day, and like some people say it might be this, that, like, you know, again, I think it speaks to the previous, what we were talking about before, is that a lot of the things that scare us today are very similar to the sorts of fears that people had way back when. Now, you know, way back when, again, this is a Joseph Plum Martin account. He was talking about jack-o'-lanterns flying through the air and like wistfully, you know, they tried to like catch them and whatnot. He has like a whole diatribe about how like, you know, all these professors and academics say that jack-o'-lanterns can't fly and they don't exist. Well, that's BS. I saw like 8 of them the other night. But even if it's not a jack-o'-lantern, maybe it's something, you know, whatever it would be today. A lot of those core ideas.
I'm gonna end you there.
All right. Yes.
Thank you for that. That was very cool. I like the jack-o'-lanterns. They were my favorite part. But let's move on a little bit because we have classics, but we also have modern. And what is, to you, something that is an important part of modern horror as opposed to classic horror? I'll start with Rina here.
I think technology is a big part of it. Partially because we live in such a technologically driven world, but you have a lot of the interplay between human and technology in a way that we don't in some earlier horror. You know, you don't have a whole lot of people being worried about what happens if you fuse a man's mind with a cart.
Right.
in the 17th century kind of thing. But we do worry about what happens when humans become part of a machine, what happens when the machines take over, Terminator style kind of thing. Uh, you know, the interplay between humans and technology and humanity and what it means to be human in this era, I think, for me, that's one of the biggest parts of modern horror. And it's one of the things I find myself constantly going to when I'm thinking about writing in the modern era. And our reliance on technology, how we use it, how it affects the things that are around us. How does it change what we see, how we perceive what we're seeing? We can research things we couldn't research before in the past. If you were in 1920s and you saw a ghost, you couldn't just go Google the hauntings of this particular site. You relied a lot on word of mouth kind of thing. Like, how does technology change how we perceive the horror and the horrible things? So for me, I think technology would be the biggest aspect of modern approach to horror, and just how we interact with it and how we're part of it.
Thank
Interesting.
you. That was excellent, Brandon.
Yeah. Well, actually, interesting on the same idea, actually. So do you think that, I think, yeah, the way that like technology and humans are interplaying with it is a really interesting idea. We see a little bit of that with, like, again, Frankenstein is like the classic example. As we go through like the Industrial Revolution and saw the scientific developments that came around in like the early 19th century, there is a lot of like concern about like technology and what it can do and whatnot. But do you think that there's been like a significant shift in terms of like how those interactions are taking place in horror stories? And I think especially you spoke to the idea of like how we're engaging with the
Mm-hmm.
technology, like
Well,
specifically on an individual level.
I think there's a lot more emphasis on how does it affect us as humans, like humanity and our place as humans, um, because it's more of an external factor when you look at at older versions of how technology interplays with humanity. Like, how does this externally affect us? Whereas now, especially with the advent of AI and everything, right, right. Whereas now, to us versus what if it is us, or what if we are it, or what, how does it fundamentally change what it means to be human, or how can it change what it means to be human? um, and I think we see that changing even over just the last 20, 30 years with the original idea of like the Matrix being where the computers take over, right? They replace us, but now what's more, they're becoming us, or we're becoming them. And so we're just sort of seeing it evolve, coming from an external perspective of us and them to us and them, and now it's just us, question mark, question mark, question mark, which I find fascinating.
Yeah, that is.
Brandon, what to you distinguishes something as modern horror versus classic horror? And I do want to come back to that point about technology because I have thoughts on the early modern period and the distinction between the soul and the body, but we'll get there.
That'd be fun. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think as well, something that you said a little earlier, Rina, as well, is the spread of information. I think that that's a very key component to, like, if you're setting a story, a horror story specifically in the modern world, by which I mean anything like, I don't know, like 1960s or 70s onwards. I'm being very generous with the term modern there. They're not generous, but there are certain expectations because the people that you're writing about have access to modern communications technology that would have been the stuff of fantasy, even just a few generations prior. And I think that places an impetus on smarter decisions being made, and it places, it's, if a character is encountering a spoopum somewhere in the story, they're not going to be like, oh my God, they're going to go to Google. They're going to do a search. They're going to find a Facebook group and a Reddit page filled to the brim with people who have had the same encounters. And it seems to me, yeah, like this, the dissemination of information and communications with like-minded individuals and all that different thing, it provides a really interesting environment where there's not as much of an excuse to have people make those stupid decisions, because it's like you can kind of prepare yourself a little bit, right? Same thing with even just like regular media. You know, we've all seen horror movies. We've all seen like the zombie apocalypse movie. So what's your excuse for not reacting in a way that's sensible? You know, like The Walking Dead, for example. I think in their lore they had to say, oh, well, zombie media just never existed in this world, right? And that's sort of like is a cheaper way of trying to get the effect, as opposed to really engaging with, yeah, like what the informational level is, what's the technology, how are these people going to be experienced with these things already, and how will that affect their way of moving forward? You know, if an 18th century person doesn't know how to deal with a zombie, well, then I don't think you can really blame them. But if a person nowadays is seeing, oh, that's an undead corpse shuffling towards me and I get away, I have 15 minutes, let me do a Google search. Oh, this is happening all over. Okay, 15,000 people have already figured out how to kill the thing.
I think Red Markets does an excellent job of handling that, because the crash doesn't happen all over at the same time. The crash happens in different locations at different times and over a period of months. And a lot of people are either panicking or trying to black it out. And there's also a lot of flooding the information space with different information, which, to your point, Brendan, I think Modern Horror isn't so much about the spoopum as it is we have all this information. The information itself, a lot of the time, becomes the enemy because so much of it is just pounding into your eyeballs. We have a term doom scrolling for a reason. We have a question that I actually really want to address, because Rina, both you and Brandon led a really good transition into this. Is, in a world of social media and surveillance, how do you keep horror hidden? And I think it's a really interesting point, because I think a lot of times we don't actually keep it hidden. It is there, but there's so much else to look at, and there's so much data going into our eyeballs at any given time, that it's not that it's hidden, it's just that it's not algorithmically at the top of our feeds.
Mm-hmm. Like, in one of my scenarios for Call of Cthulhu, which is called Jolene, the inciting incident is the PCs have all lost their partner to this mysterious woman, Jolene, right, at various points throughout the country. Okay. It is based on the song, yes. And they are drawn together because of a Reddit thread, a subreddit. And people are talking about, like, why don't more people know about this? Why aren't more people talking about this woman who seems to be everywhere and doing all of this? It's because there's so many different subreddits, and there's so much other information going on, and there's a conversation that can come up with one of the NPCs if someone asks, where it's like, well, I had to search for hours just to find this subreddit because there's so much other information going on, like about, you know, people walking off with their spouses, or missing people, or missing persons cases, and podcasts, and all of this stuff, that it just took me forever just to find this subreddit to talk about this one specific thing that happened to me. There's just so much going on that even if you make a post about it, especially now with all the generative AI going on, there deep fakes and AI posts and image creators and Chat GPT and all of that. It's so hard to sift out what is real and what is faked and what is AI and what is generated and all of that. Like, a lot of us just turn a part of our brains off for some of it, because we can't keep tabs on all of this information that's coming in.
Too much. I don't have time to focus on that. I have my other stuff going on. So,
well, I also feel like that if a zombie apocalypse did start, it would take forever for anybody to actually believe it was happening, because there'd be posts about it on social media, and we'd just be going, oh, that's another AI post, or that's just they're just making a movie, or special effects, or whatever. Like, we wouldn't actually believe it for a while, likely until it was happening to us or to someone we know who could verify that it was actually happening. So and even then, yes. So I think even though it is easier to spread information, the very fact that it is easy to spread information means there is so much of it, we can't possibly keep up with all of the horrors that are going on, or even believe all of the horrors that are going on in our horror worlds, in our horror games, because there's too much, and there's no way to know what's real and what's not.
Yeah. Did you have anything you wanted to follow up with?
Um, just a little. So I think that this also sort of speaks to a theme that we were talking about earlier, in that like if you're attempting to write a story in any time period, you really have to try and embrace what the zeitgeist of that time is, right? And if there is any modern day zeitgeist, it is social media, it is communications technology, it is how much information there is out there at all times, right? And so like if you actually do want to keep a horror hidden in this modern world, that's tough, right? You can't just be like, oh, well, none of the characters had their cell phones on them at the time because it was a dare. That sort of thing is going to be cheap, and it doesn't, like you can get away with it, sure, but will it really speak to the horrors and the anxiety that people are dealing with today? Well, probably not, because it would feel cheap, right? If you really genuinely want to keep the horror hidden, it would require a great deal of creativity, which I'm sure I do not have. But you would have to like craft whatever the horror is, whatever the big bad or whatever is, in a way that makes sense, assuming all else is the same today, right? But don't just like pull out a cheap stop to have an excuse why the internet's down, the phone lines aren't working, the power's out, they're isolated in the middle of nowhere. It's because the
I
more
mean,
things that you
I think that's kind of what Rena and I were saying, is that you don't really need, I don't think you need that cheap, oh, their cell phones
Mm.
were off or the power was out at the time, because they're just focusing
yeah,
on
like
something
like you
else.
can like play to that. Exactly. It's like that's the world we live in. And so there are things you can do to make that the case. So try to, as much as you can, play to your setting as opposed to rejecting parts of the setting that are just inconvenient for you at the time.
But you can also, as long as you do it without making it just a cheap trick, you can also make that suddenly losing access to the phone line, the Wi-Fi is not working, whatever,
That's
make it
fucking
part of the horror,
terrifying.
because it's terrifying, because we are surrounded by information all the time. We always know where people are. We always know what's going on. Like I always know I can get a hold of my partner. I always know I can check in on my family members, whatever. I have access to so many things. And if suddenly for some reason I'm in a dead zone, and weird things are happening to me and I cannot access my phone. I've done that to players in a scenario before, and one of them joked that they had to make a sand roll for them, the player,
Yeah.
because they were so freaked out by suddenly all of this was happening, and they couldn't call their parents. The character couldn't do this. They couldn't check to see if it was happening to other people. Did they know? Is this just happening to me? Am I imagining this, or is it just targeted at me, or is it happening worldwide? I don't know. So you can actually do it that way as well, because in the modern world, another horror is being completely cut off.
Yeah. And I think that isolation is a very cool and very interesting part of modern horror, especially with Marx's theory of alienation, which, well, of course we're going to talk about a little bit here. But the sort of atomization of our social lives, and this kind of dividing everything into neat, digestible chunks, is very, very interesting to me personally as part of modern horror. Because, and I want to talk a little bit about Gothic horror now, because Gothic does tend to be very grounded in time and place. And that is not to say that only the good Gothic comes from like the 1800s or the 1700s or whatever, the heyday of Gothic, if you will. But like, we still have excellent Gothic coming out now, like the September House by Carissa Orlando, for example. Phenomenal piece of Gothic literature. Um, Bluebeard's Bride, put out by Magpie Games. Oh, such a phenomenal Gothic game. One of the best Gothic games I think we have in existence right now. But Gothic itself is kind of, again, grounded in this sense of time and place. And I have the question in front of me. Let me pull it up. And sort of, for both of the two of you, how does that sort of translated when updated? Because a lot of times when we think of Gothic horror, we think of like big spooky mansions and graveyards and abandoned woods, but like you can have city gothic, you can have suburban gothic. So sort of what is sort of the most important thing to you to keep when you're writing like a modern gothic scenario or a modern gothic short story or something like that?
Well, again, it's not the sort of thing that I'm very, very experienced with, so I will defer to both of you as far as the details go. But I really do think it's a question of look to what those things represent, right? It's the dark castle and the dark hill and the dark woods. Well, what does that really mean on the ground for the people who are encountering it? And those core feelings can absolutely be translated to a modern day setting. You know, maybe it's an internet outage area, maybe it's the billionaire's estate, and it's not the dark woods, but it's a concrete jungle. You know, there are absolutely parallels that you can make. It's just a matter of understanding what those, you know, tropes are saying at the end of the day, right?
I think for me, it's the feeling of decay,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's spiritual decay for the characters or it's the physical decay you get around you, or both, however you're using it. Um, and you can use that in some really creative and interesting ways in modern Gothic. Looking at, for example, in big cities where you have these areas of the city that are being gentrified, and they're slowly falling into ruin so that someone else can come swooping in and turn them into condos or high rises or whatever, but they're being allowed to decay first. You have the spiritual decay. What does that represent for us in the modern age? What are the things that cause a spirit to decay? Not just, sitting in a dark, gloomy library all alone for forever. It makes your soul rot away. What is it that makes that happen for you now? Could be the soulless billionaire, for example, who's uh, been sitting in his office for so many years. He's had no contact with people, and so he has no connection to humanity anymore, and you can see him literally rotting away on the inside, while he's still pleasant and well dressed and sporting his 3 Rolexes and his Lamborghini and his Tesla, whatever it is. But that feeling of decay translates very well in very interesting ways. And for me, that's the most interesting and most important element of Gothic scenario writing for me.
Yeah, I agree. Something I noticed we're talking a lot about is sort of isolation or separation, not just from people around us, but also from our own humanity, which I think is a very interesting modern point because that sort of differentiation between body and soul wasn't really a thing for much of history. Like you sort of had that very much the body is the soul. They are the same person. But then sort of in the early modern period, coincidentally around the time of the witch hunts, which were done by secular authorities, which I have a lot of opinions about on how they're portrayed. But you get this sort of idea that the soul is the intelligence powering the body, which is in itself a machine. And I think that speaks both to sort of classic horror that we were talking about, where you do sort of get this like blend between the body and the soul kind of still there, but then you move into more technological modern horror and then you start to see that split where the body becomes the machine and the soul becomes the intelligence. And I think that's really interesting when talking about isolation because we sort of become isolated from both our body and our souls. And what does that leave us with? And that's actually a really interesting question, Har, because is the mind different from the soul? Is the mind different from the body? How do these things sort of connect? Where is it that you lose that humanity? And that is something I love about Bluebeard's Bride as a game, because you get sort of that addressing of the mind and the body, and things are happening to your mind that are also happening to your body, or things are happening to your body that cause your mind to work a different way. And you can shatter into different pieces and actually become part of the house, which is fascinating and beautiful and such a cool way of handling that. But yeah, I think to both of your points, that sort of that decay, but also the body is the house, right? Like the setting reflects the character, reflects the setting, reflects the character. Because if the character going into the haunted house should basically become the haunted house when they come back out of it. They should the haunted house is them. Um, yeah. Hmm. Call that dialectical tension, baby. We love that. Bluebeard Bride. Another game that I think does
Mm.
this really well that I'm the editor for is Cult Divinity Lost, which is one of the sponsors of this weekend. Shout out Helmgast. Um, but deliberately in Cult, one of the things that happens is your soul will always grow a body no matter where it is. So your soul will always, even when you die, when you go to your little essentially cell of forgetfulness under a citadel of one of the archons, your soul will have a body because your soul perceives itself as a person. So your soul is always embodied in Cult, which says a lot of really interesting things about. There's been a lot of really interesting, like, even between the first edition and Divinity Lost, there's actually been some really interesting writing about what it means to be transgender in Cult, and why, for example, one might be born transgender in the world of Cult Divinity Lost, and what that says about the things that this person has been through lifetimes. And also because before we were imprisoned as gods, we were able to change gender. We were able to change our shape. We were able to be whatever the hell we wanted from day to day. And sometimes your body just remembers that when you go into a specific incarnation. And I don't know. I think it's very interesting what cult does for the body and the soul as well. Um, but I want to talk a little bit about hauntology because that is one of my favorite weird little academic buzzwords. Um, because something that happens in Gothic and a lot of horror is the idea of the past haunting the future. Or the past haunting the present, rather. We'll get into the future in a minute. But the past haunting the present, and this being a very, very scary idea for us. And why I'll start with you, Brandon, because I can see you have an opinion on this. Why is that so scary for us?
In its most immediate sense, I suppose. I mean, you could say something about how it's we have an idea of the past, right? We have some sense of familiarity, which means that we can conceive of it, right? However, it is inherently unknowable. And even to individuals like myself, I dedicate like my life to the study of a particular time period, trying to better understand it. But no matter how many books I read, no matter how many hour-long rants I can go on, like you've seen a little hint of before, it is inherently unknowable to me in as far as the complete picture goes. And there is something that can be a little unnerving about that, I think, right? Especially when history is something which is inherently so impactful. It's inherently so. I don't have to go on a diatribe about how it informs our world today. It is the direct cause of everything that we are, and for that matter, everything that we will be, arguably. And so whenever you're dealing with any sort of historical question, there's sort of this like baked in, you might even say, anxiety about it. There's an anxiety about the meaning of the history. There's an anxiety over how much we really know versus how much we can know. There's an anxiety over all these different things. And I think that in a lot of horror, there is that sort of like baked in vague familiarity with, okay, the window is going like shuddering, open and close or whatever. I understand that can be the wind, but like, what if it's not though? And there's I'm sure there's some sort of a relationship there that an individual more versed could espouse on to a greater degree, but anxiety, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Rena?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the being confronted with how much we don't know and how much our perceptions of the past can be challenged by being haunted by that past. One of my favorite things in ghost stories is favorite tropes is when the ghosts they're being haunted by turns out to be not the bad guy. Like the ghost is actually trying to warn them, or the ghost is the victim of something even worse that's happening in the house, or the mansion, or the museum, or the whatever it is. Like, that's one of my favorite things, because it's challenging our preconceptions. And being haunted by the past does that a lot. We think we know what happened in the past. We think we know who this person is. We think we know who our family member is. We think we know about, old Uncle Timmy and his mansion and his will and his reclusive nature and all that. But what do we actually know? And we have to be okay with being confronted with those things, and we're very much not. We don't like being confronted by our preconceptions and finding out that they're wrong, and having to relearn things and reformat how we approach our present. And so I think that's the biggest fear there is that, oh no, we're wrong about something, because we can't really know the past. We didn't live through it.
And I mean, and we don't have to be talking about 100 years ago for that to be the case. That could be earlier today, right? It's, there nothing in the past is entirely knowable because we are inherently flawed, limited, beings within being itself.
And we don't like changing our ideas on things as human beings. And so even the past we lived through is colored very much by our perception of it and what we'd lived through, and what we experienced and what we were bringing to the table. So even having our recent past challenged in a haunting of any sorts is very uncomfortable, and it's very scary, and it makes us rethink things that we don't really want to think about, because it's very uncomfortable for human beings.
Yeah. My fiance will remind me of things that I've said and done all the time that I have zero recollection of. And it's like, I don't like
nightmare
that.
fuel. Yeah.
It is.
I'm going to say something here that's going to make Brandon have an absolute aneurysm.
Wow.
One of my favorite pieces of hauntology is the Victorian conception of medieval torture.
Oh no, that's a fantastic. Honestly,
Yep.
the Victorians got so much wrong about so many things. It's one of my favorite things is to read Victorian history books because they're so bad.
So, a friend of mine, John Greenaway, is one of the hosts on Horror Vanguard. Excellent podcast, by the way. You should all go listen to it. But one of the things he's sort of talked about is how the Victorians have this conception, and they also talked about this on You're Wrong About to a much greater extent, and that's an excellent episode. But something they talk about, both of these podcasts talk about a lot, is how the Victorians were so desperate to make themselves the moral arbiters of their time that in order to do so, they had to make everybody before them seem barbaric, because we sort of want this idea of the moral arc of history bending towards justice. And a lot of the Victorians could not put up with the idea that people in the Middle Ages were they were clean. They did wear colors. The rack was actually more of a threat than anything. Like, there were people who were racked, but it wasn't used for small crimes. And, like, yes, there were people who were hanged, drawn, and quartered, but it's a lot less than we think. And sort of to both your points, the idea that, like, we have this conception, oh, the past is dark and scary and barbaric, but maybe it was the victim of someone in the more recent past trying to make themselves seem better. And to me, that's actually scarier, because someone trying to make themselves I grew up far right, so someone trying to make themselves into a moral arbiter, very, very scary to me. It's also why I refer to QAnon as a LARP without any safety rules. But and yeah, there is always sort of this whisper of what happened before, and it gets distorted and changed. And the fact that we know it can get distorted and changed, but also we're sort of living with that, is that dialectical tension can be very scary. So I think both of you brought up phenomenal points on that end, and feelings. Um, but let's go from hauntology from a different direction. We also see in games, in shows like Terminator, or in games like the God Machine Chronicle, we see the future haunting the present. And this, we sort of go more into the idea of the unknown. We focus more on that. And like, what does if you're reading something about the future haunting the present, like what does that sort of mean to you, rather as a reader or a writer or a developer? What it if anything, what interests you about that?
I think it's a form of doom spiraling,
Okay.
of taking a modern fear of something happening and then spinning it out as far as we possibly can into the future.
Mm-hmm.
And then using that to, well, this is what the future is going to look like. This is what it could look like. This is what I am afraid it will look like. It's very much getting into these. I'm afraid of this, and what if this
Mm-hmm.
happens? And if this happens, then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then it spins completely out into this is our idea of what the future looks like. And I I find that I find that really interesting. I read somewhere that science fiction, for example, is all about the problems of the present,
Yep.
just in a futuristic setting. And I think futuristic horror does, and horror that thinks about the future does that in similar ways, where it is very much these are the things we're scared of now.
Mm-hmm.
And here's what it could look like if we just add in some things that we're also worried about, like machines taking over in Terminator, or becoming part of the Matrix, or whatever. Uh, Projecting ourselves and projecting technology and projecting the state of humanity into the future. It's very much a doom spiral in a way I find absolutely fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like sort of the idea of this future that we have then created sort of coming back to haunt us, because now, oh, we have this conception of what the future will look like, so now that we have to behave as though that is the
Mm-hmm.
future. And then that gets real weird because you're still in the present, but now it's a present colored by this future that you have drawn for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's also, in much the same way that there's a very human kind of anxiety about the unknowable, the past, right, the history. I could just cheat and say the same thing for the future, which is fair. But I think that there's also a certain anxiety and uncomfortableness around that which is seemingly absolute. You will die. That can be difficult to accept, and it's very easy to fall into the pattern of trying desperately to resist it, and in trying to resist it so much you just end up making it happen directly, or you miss out on the things that are on the way to that point, or whatever it would be. And so I think it's a classic trope every time you're dealing with any kind of time travel or prophecy or whatever it would be. It's someone trying to change that, right? It's someone trying to not make it be the case. I think it's like the obverse of that coin, right? It's we don't like when we don't know something, and when we really do know something, that doesn't necessarily provide much comfort either, because it takes away agency, it takes away choice, and that's not fun.
Yeah. One of the weirder aspects I've encountered of this, and if either of you have anything similar, please feel free to jump in. I was doing actually a lot of research on specifically evangelical rapture horror earlier this year, and one of the weirdest, yeah, Rena's been following this. One of the weirdest things I realized was not not the political nature of the guillotine. We already know about that, but the temporal nature of the guillotine in rapture horror, because when the men who came up with rapture theology were children was when the French Revolution was going on, and the guillotine was this massive symbol of terror, especially to Christians because of the de-Christianization of France. because of nobles being afraid of being guillotined. So they're like, oh, they're going to guillotine good Christian men and women, which gets put on top of the dechristianization. But then you have a verse in Revelations that says the faithful will be beheaded. So now you have these men who grew up during the French Revolution being like, oh, the guillotine's going to be used. The first reference I could find to this was in 1908. So this has been a thing for at least a century. And then you get to the Thief in the Night series and the Left Behind series, about 20 years apart. And Thief in the Night was a huge influence on the Left Behind series. And then you see the guillotine as future haunting the present, because the past is haunting the men who came up with rapture theology, but now, because they said, oh, it's obviously going to be the guillotine is something we have to look out for in this future horror that we are communicating to you as fiction, but you know it's not fiction. The guillotine is something that is inevitable in the future for Christians. So now you have it coming from both ends. And I'm sure I can think of something that does the same thing. I can't off the top of my head because I was at PAX for 12 hours today. But if either of you have anything that you can think of that does something similar, I'd be interested in that.
That's a really interesting question.
I think because, like, we were talking about Call of Cthulhu, and I'm wearing
Mhm.
my little Delta Green shirt, like, I think we actually kind of get that with certain Cthulhu monsters
Hmm.
because they seem so, like, archaic and very timeless, but a lot of them also have access to, like, futuristic technology that we don't have
Mhm.
access to. And, like, some of them become sort of like both past and future at the same time. But
Like the
that's
Yithians.
go
Mhm.
ahead.
Say the Yithians, for example, or the Great
Yeah.
Race in Call of
Oh yeah.
Cthulhu, for sure. Uh,
Hounds of Tindalos, I think, might be another
yeah,
one.
the Tindalos. Yeah, everything my brain is coming up with is religious, so I'm staying away from that. Um, but yeah, that's really fascinating. Coming from the past to haunt the future, and then all converging on the present. Like,
Mhm.
I also grew up in those circles, so now my brain is
Yeah.
exploding because it explains so much about my horror
You're
philosophy.
so welcome. I have a zine about it because I got rejected from an academic journal writing about it. So whatever.
Mhm.
But no, and it's just because we're talking about classic and modern horror, like, and sort of seeing where not where a timeline ends necessarily, but where something changes and, like, oh, this is past haunting present, or this is future haunting present, or this is something that is present that is haunting us as it exists, I think is really interesting. Um, we get a lot of weird sort of interplay with time in horror, and I think that is really fascinating. And not just time travel either, but like sort of how time slows down when we get emotional over something. And I think we see that in both classic and modern horror. If you Would you guys agree with that? Like, I don't think that's something we see specifically in one or the other.
Yeah, I think that it falls pretty easily under one of those core human experiences. You know,
Mhm.
whatever the external factors are that we're dealing with,
Mhm.
this idea of slowing down and how that information is being processed. I do think that there is an interesting distinction to be made, and especially if you're setting something in a different time period, it's worth really deeply considering. Is how those sorts of experiences are comprehended, how they're interpreted, and
Mhm.
how they're discussed. But it is still that core experience, like, not to, I won't go on a long like history thing, but one of the things that I work with, and I'm planning on doing a dissertation on it in the future, is the experience of trauma and post-traumatic stress in historic environments. So in
Oh, that's
particular,
fascinating.
like soldiers in the 18th century, they are very clearly experiencing what we today understand as PTSD, right? but they don't think of it in those terms. They don't know how to describe it in those terms, and so they'll describe like some of the most. They will have written down some of the most horrific experiences you can imagine, and they'll say, "I found this to be very affecting. This was a deeply affecting experience," and they'll describe post-traumatic dreams that they're having and flashbacks. Like, yeah, sometimes it comes to me. It's I don't know. Anyways, we can move on from that now. And
Granddad was never really the same after Trin.
Exactly. They were never the same after the war. I mean, it's that, yeah, it's the same. And so, yeah, like the idea of time slowing down and having flashbacks and conceiving of the past and how it's affecting, especially in a world, like you said before, that is so heavily theological and, it's spiritual, and the rapture is around the corner and all that stuff. That plays such an integral role in how individuals are conceiving of horror and dealing with horror, right? Whether in real life or in a fictional setting. So it's absolutely worth giving some real serious thought to.
I've noticed with time, it's interesting to me. We deal with time quite a bit in classic and in modern, but how we deal with it is very different. In a lot of ways, like for example, a lot of classic horror writing, especially Gothic, tends to take place over long periods of time. Long periods of time. Don't even get me started on the Mysteries of Udolpho. Thank you, Anne Radcliffe. Took eons off my life. But even short novels like Carmilla, for example, will take months, and things happen in short intervals, or they'll just say, and this happened. Oh yes, over the last 3 months, one thing happened, and then they move on, and it's like it barely existed. Whereas a lot of more modern stuff tends to be very short bursts of time. A single night, for example, if you're doing like Friday the 13th, or a couple of weeks, or maybe a couple of months. And even then, you get a lot of very detailed look at things that are happening throughout that short expanse of time. And it's just such a different way of dealing with time and how we perceive it. Like I think we want things all now. Like we want things to happen very quickly now. Like that's just what we're used to. And so in the media that we consume, especially in horror, we think it needs to be quick and it needs to be fast, and we need it all now. And like, well, why are they taking 6 months in between hauntings? What is that ghost doing?
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean the ghost threw a book across the dining room table on November the 1st, and it is now July the 2nd, and we still haven't had another reappearance of this ghost? You know.
Oh my god, I'm such a bitch for a slow burn though.
Oh, I am too. It's just interesting that it doesn't tend to happen. Like even like something taking Poe, like the Fall of the House of Usher adaptation, which is phenomenal.
Oh, yeah.
By the way, it's absolutely amazing. It still happens in over the course of 2 weeks max. Like all of these things are happening. These Poe stories are all playing out in very, very short amounts of time. And Hill House and everything else is doing the same thing. So we're getting these stories played out a lot faster than even the original inspiration where they came from, which I find really, really interesting.
I really wish I'd watched that show before this panel because wow, we could have done some like point-to-point comparisons.
Oh my god, yes. I've seen it
very,
twice.
very good.
I've seen it twice. You need to see it.
So we have 2 questions here that I want to answer. First, I'm just going to say this is a trick question for me, but you guys might have other opinions. What's scarier, Infinity or the Finite? And I'm going to say both. Next question.
Yeah, it depends on how you play it, because they can both be absolutely terrifying depending on the setting that you're dealing with.
Yep. I used to have actual panic attacks about the concept of Infinity when I was old enough to start thinking about it.
I'm still terrified by the concept of Infinity. Like, no thank you. I don't want it.
Because death is horrifying, but living forever might actually just be worse.
Yeah.
Right? I mean...
Well, now I'm upsetting myself. I'm going to take a Xanax after this panel. Hell yeah. We have another question, which is, does ritual have a place in modernity? Or is that a remnant of historical/classic horror? And I'm going to say, hey, do you set an alarm clock on your phone and then listen to music to wake up? That's a ritual.
Rituals have changed, but they are still very much a part of our daily lives.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
I think one of the most horrifying rituals I've ever read in a game was actually during an opening fiction for the first edition of Chronicles of Darkness, the Mirrors book. And it was a chapter opening fiction, and it was either the Mirrors book or it was the Second Sight book, both of which are pretty good. Second Sight was better, but whatever. Um, there is a scene of a bunch of well-dressed people in an abandoned subway station standing over this dark crack in reality, and they're all holding eyeballs. You don't know why they're holding eyeballs, but they're each holding a single blue eyeball. And they're about to, drop these. And then this thief who has been watching them steals one of the eyeballs. And like they all dissolve into wailing and screaming because they were not able to make this second. Like they're all dressed in like business casual to business semi-formal, and they're all clean and they're all scrubbed, but they're all freaking out and falling into this very human state of panic because, oh god, we can't appease the big thing. And that stuck with me because that was such a cool use of like what we would think of as like classic horror ritual, but in a very interesting way. But Rina, you run Call of Cthulhu, so why don't you tell us about rituals in modern horror?
Well, I avoid rituals as much as possible. I may be guilty of having a ritual or two in my classic era or earlier, like Victorian era stuff, but generally I avoid it. But I do think there's a place for it. It is a trope, but it's a useful trope. And there's ways to do it that aren't just a bunch of people standing around in robes, standing around a pentagram and chanting at each other. Rituals can take on so many different meanings. Like it could just be someone who repeats a prayer over a bowl of blood every morning because she believes that it keeps Cthulhu from waking up. And if she doesn't do this every morning, Cthulhu is going to wake up. And so that is a form of ritual that you can use there. It doesn't have to be cultists all the time, but we rely on rituals as human beings. We really need them, whether it is setting your alarm and then listening to music like Jax was saying, or it's twisting the doorknob 3 times on your way out the door because that's what helps you remember that you locked it and you've got your keys in your pocket, or it's going to the same coffee shop every morning, or it's a religious ritual, or it's whatever it is. You do the things that you do because they give you meaning, whether it's because you believe it's going to stop Cthulhu from waking up, or it's because it's going to stop something worse from happening, or it's because it helps you remember that you've got your keys in your pocket when you're on your way to work so you don't have a panic attack. Ritual isn't something that's confined to the past. It's something we use, and we can use it on a grander scale or a smaller scale in our horror fiction, in our gaming. It doesn't have to just be sitting around in robes in a circle chanting at a pentagram.
Hell yeah. Like I am currently engaging in one of my yearly rituals, which is I go to PAX Unplugged with my partner, who is from Canada, who totally exists and is definitely in the other room. She says hello. Um, but we always stay a week in Philadelphia. We always go to PAX Unplugged, and we always have a break day after PAX Unplugged. And that is something that we both look forward to every year, and that is a ritual.
And that's actually that's a big thing, isn't it? Is that a ritual can be for something positive, a positive experience. It can be for a negative experience or to prevent a negative experience. It can just become something completely benign. But regardless of what it's for, if there is a ritual behind it, if it's something regular, it speaks to an underlying anxiety, an underlying concern that if you don't do it, if something goes wrong, then something's going to happen. Whenever I go to leave the house, I have like my 3-pat system, pat, pat, pat to check phone, keys, wallet, that it's all there. And every once in a while, it's like if I'm, especially if I'm somewhere public, but if I go to do like the third pat and my wallet isn't there, there's like that momentary dropped, heart in the feeling,
Yep.
because of financial anxiety, because of my ability to identify myself anxiety, whatever it is. There's always something there, and or like you said before, if you're passing through a dead zone, not usually a big deal, but if you're used to checking your phone to seeing, did the Mr. or the Mrs. send me a message today? Oh, it's not there. Throws you off a little bit, and you can play with that.
Yeah. There is a note here is how does our understanding of mental health today reflect in our modern horror? That is an entire panel unto itself. But we were just sort of talking about ritual, and I think our sort of impulse is to be like, oh, that sounds like OCD. But no, even a compulsion is only different from a ritual in the what's the word I'm looking for? In the sort of conscious way we do it. The conscious way we do it, I think, is compulsions and hello, I just got an OCD diagnosis, so I've been learning a lot about it. But the compulsions become subconscious, right? Because they are something you blink and you're doing it because that is how you keep the obsession away. But a ritual, I think in a lot of ways, you have to be consciously doing it. Like I they can be sort of second nature, but in a lot of ways they're not going to be there's something you're going to be thinking about doing. Like if I'm setting my alarm and putting on my playlist, I'm choosing the playlist, right? Like this is not something I have to do or and it's hard, right? Because I say it's not something I have to do or the world will end because that implies that that ablative rituals that stop the world from ending are not rituals, they're compulsions. But there's an element of agency involved in a ritual, I think. And compulsive ritualized behavior is only different from ritualized behavior in how distressing it is to you in a lot of ways. Um so yeah, I think wow, rituals in modern day are so interesting. Like I'm so glad that got brought up because I think that's a really fun thing to talk about. And you're right, it is not just a bunch of people chanting in a circle, but there's so many ways it can be done and like games like I think games that do this most literally, Mage the Ascension and Mage the Awakening are sort of the big ones that do this because so much of those games are about building your rituals, right? And like the objects you're using and what are your focuses and what are your tools and what are your guiding principles. And some people are like, yeah, I have a fucking laptop that I do my rituals on. And if you're right, if your if your praxis is technological and that is how you engage in your ritualized behavior, then it's your ritual. And that's ah excited flail. Let's see. What else do I want to ask you guys? Because this has been fun so far. Um, no, no, I don't think they do. I don't think they do. I think it depends on the vampire. Well, if you have, and Rena, you can contradict me on this if you think this is the case. World of Darkness vampires, when they drink your blood, they're specific. The blood is the life, right? You get
Mm-hmm.
that from Dracula. It is a very classic line from Bram Stoker's "The blood is the life," and in the World of Darkness and the Chronicles of Darkness, that is taken very literally because what the vampire is essentially ingesting is, is oh god, Catholic fucking spiritual theory. Sorry, what you're essentially ingesting at the point of contact is not like hemoglobin and platelets and whatnot, it becomes life force once it hits the vampire. Vitae is not.
the vampire's breath would smell before consumption, but after it's rejuvenated with life, it would become brought back to full.
Potentially.
Okay.
I
I wasn't
don't
expecting that to
know.
lead to an actual conversation.
I think because the Vitae is not going to make the vampire's breath smell, is I think what I'm getting
Yeah.
at.
Yeah.
Agreed.
That's fair. Yeah, I could get behind
But
that.
I think in other certain settings where vampires are less both spiritual, because there are certain settings where vampires are more animalistic, right? And they're not also spiritual and emotional predators. They are physical predators. So I think in that case, you're gonna get more vampire's breath smell. So if you're focusing on like the body as machine, as we were talking about earlier, and the vampire is not looking to consume the soul, the life force, they eat iron, they eat hemoglobin, they eat platelets, they eat white and red blood cells. It's gonna stink.
There you go. See, this is why you're the
You're just
host. That was great. That's why
thanks.
you're in charge.
God, I wish someone would stop giving me responsibility. Don't stop giving me responsibility, Ryan. I have fun with it. It's how I met Rina.
It's
It's a
true.
good time. It's a good, you know, I don't even remember our panel last year, but I remember it was good. But yeah, no, vampires are also really interesting, I think, for our sort of discussion of classic and modern horror, because the vampire does represent a lot of different things, but it always comes back to that idea of predation. Even if we're talking about the Cullens, because we mentioned Twilight, even if we are talking about consensual predation, can we argue that Twilight is actually a religious kink BDSM novel? I think we can.
I mean, I've always seen it that way, so
Right.
I,
It is Mormon religious kink, the novel.
mm-hmm.
And the vampire, in that sense, is not your sort of like, ooh, spooky Dracula vampire. It is very much this person who is looking to share consensually in your life force. It is the idea of a relationship with this person who needs you because you are alive and you have this sort of quality to you that they need. And Edward Cullen, while creepy, is not actually the sort of person who is going to take that quality from you without asking, or in this case, marrying you. But thoughts, comments, questions?
No, I mean that's always how I've seen it is the religious cake style, but just it's got its own horrors for me. Twilight does, outside of horror, vampire horror, um, just 100-something-year-old vampire and a 17-year-old girl,
Yeah.
creepy, creepy, creepy. But I think it is interesting to see the different way vampires are played versus the classic just I want to drink your blood and I am a metaphor for sexual tension kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I love me a vampire. I'll watch just about anything that's got vampires in it, although I have yet to see the Vampire Diaries. That's the one thing I haven't gotten around to yet. But I will watch, read, consume just about anything with vampires.
I mean, there's so much versatility behind it, isn't it? It's everything from, like they're basically just zombies all the way up to, like we're talking about today, they're just walking around in the world and they're having daily conversations. And, it's a kind of flexibility that like you don't see as often with something like a werewolf, for example. I mean, there is still flexibility. You just don't see it as often in popular culture, I feel like. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't engage with it as much. But I mean, I can't think of anywhere near as many werewolf films as I can vampire films.
Bet you need to watch Ginger Snaps.
So I've been told, actually.
But oh god, I was gonna say, oh, I have a modern horror rec that is written as a classic horror that I think both of you will enjoy and chat will enjoy. Speaking of vampires, The Gilda Stories by Jewel Gomez.
I just got that book. I just
It
bought
is
it.
phenomenal. Please read it because it goes from the antebellum South to 2050. And it is phenomenal. It is about a black queer female vampire, and it's real good. So if you want to actually see a progression from classic to modern horror, because the writing style actually changes as the setting changes, it's very, very good. Um, I have another question here. Can we talk uncanny, things that are close to humanity but reveal an strangeness or unnerving feature slash behavior? Yes, and I think we actually have some pretty good examples of those in both classic and modern horror. The most obvious, to me anyway, modern version would be Agent Smith from The Matrix.
Mm-hmm. Valley of the
Is it because
Dolls.
is it because I have a crush on Hugo Weaving in that role because of all of his little micro expressions? Maybe, but that seems like a very good example. Is the agents in The Matrix are sort of like the prime that and the Terminators, but those are sort of the prime this is human, this is not human, but it's too close. But what are some
See,
other examples we can think of in
I,
both classic
I
and modern?
I always tend to go more in the opposite direction. Like I think you sort of went in the direction of like they are so human it's almost impossible to tell.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever I think of like the uncanny and the things that really
Mm-hmm.
like freak me out with uncanny, it's sort of in the opposite direction to where it's like
Well, they're
they're
specifically
very
asking about close to humanity but reveal a strangeness in this
oh well
question.
that's right. I was gonna say I always think of like flesh gates and wendigos and things like that, right? To where it's getting close enough to humanity that it disturbs us, but it
Mm-hmm.
still is showing an animalistic nature, as it were.
Right.
I think of things like changelings, right?
Mm,
And not necessarily changeling the dreaming kind of thing, but
or lost,
where
but it's fine.
yeah, where a, a f- a child gets replaced by a changeling and they're human ish. They look like the person, they grow up like the person, but there's always just something wrong. I also think of Scott Dorward's excellent scenario Fairyland for Cthulhu
Mm-hmm.
Dark,
Mm-hmm.
which involves a very, very creepy set of children who are very human, except they're not. And there's just something slightly off putting about them, and you can't quite figure out what it is until the violence starts, and then you realize that these
Yeah.
are not children at all. Um, I don't know. My brain goes to child replacement horror for some reason when I think about the uncanny. Whenever I go beyond Agent Smith, anyway.
I actually,
um,
because something that we said earlier, and the idea just popped in my head. I love it, and this is something I'm going to think about a lot more. I think not just like child replacement, but granddad hasn't been the same since he came back from the war, right?
mm-hmm.
If
Yes.
you want to talk uncanny, it happens in real life all the
Mm-hmm.
time where people go through traumatic experiences that change them and make them into different people on a
No,
fundamental
there's not
level, right?
entire horror games about this at all.
Well, yeah. But I think in
It's
terms
changing
of
lost.
like we see it all the time in a historic environment.
Yeah,
I think that's a really fun idea. It's yeah,
I think
something to
we
play
see it
with,
all
I
the
think.
time in a modern environment too.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
And I know that I actually tend to find myself drawn towards the uncanny in games, like if it also weirdly Agent Smith, but um, but I find myself drawn to for a more classic example, deep ones in early Lovecraft and changelings in more modern variations of changelings because you sort of see these metaphors for neurodivergence and
Mhm.
like uncanny behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting to sort of explore that through a more fantastic lens, because I think in a lot of ways you get closer to the emotional truth of what it's like to experience that. For me, anyway, like Changeling Lost saved my life as a game. Um, but it's so interesting to see sort of what we will take and magnify and be like, this is not normal. This is not human? Question
Yeah,
mark.
what are the traits that we change to be
Yeah,
weird all of a sudden?
yeah.
Well,
Um,
there's also just different ways of approaching how you play with the uncanny when it comes to horror, because there's the aspect of it of the uncanny being a losing yourself, losing your identity, losing what makes you human or what makes you different, like in what's the movie I'm thinking? Stepford Wives, for example.
right.
Or is it the feeling the uncanny, like you are the uncanny, like
Mm-hmm.
neurodivergence, like as an autistic kid I felt that way all the time.
Yeah.
Like I felt like a changeling because I felt like I'm the different one, and
Mm-hmm.
everyone else is just like all seems to have these understandings of what it is to be a human, and I don't
Yep.
completely understand or fit in. And so there's just different aspects to using the uncanny, and how the uncanny becomes horror, or is approached
Mm-hmm.
as horror based on how you're looking at it. Which
Yep.
aspect of societal horror are you playing with there?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. Yeah, absolutely. Um, I think you and I are drawn to the uncanny for very, very similar reasons. And it's
Mm-hmm.
just kind of fun to see what we can find in that liminal space. Um, yeah, we have about 20 minutes left. I'd like to, if anybody has any questions, if we can get them in the next 5 minutes, because otherwise I'm going to drop my banger question
Oh
that we're
no.
going to end the panel with. But my other recommendation, if you're interested in uncanny children's stories, The Moor Child by Eloise McGraw is about a changeling child who is left in a town, in a medieval town, and it is actually very historically focused, and it's so cute. It's very uncanny, but it's very cute. And this changeling child decides of her own free will that what she's going to do is go rescue the human baby that she was switched with, and then she's going to go make her own fortune. And I'm just like, I love you so much. We have a question. What are your favorite tropes? Do we have any favorite tropes in modern or classic or both? I know I love a Skynet. I love a weird machine intelligence that is doing stuff. I love Skynet. I love the God Machine. I love the 18 fucking. I can swear on this, right, Ryan? I have the 18, the 18 machine intelligences and GURPS Reign of Steel that all have their own dumb opinions. They're my children. I love them very much. But yeah, no, I love a machine intelligence doing stuff. I love changelings, as we have so thoroughly discussed. Um, yeah, what are some of your guys' favorite tropes?
Okay, so
Rina?
one of my favorite TV shows in the world is Hannibal,
Okay.
and and it has one of the tropes that I love most, which is the forbidden longing, where you have the sexual tension, the attraction, the should I, shouldn't I, and it's very very clear that no you shouldn't, but it's
Yep.
still extremely compelling and dangerous and delightful,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's
Mm-hmm.
between, a vampire and a victim who's attracted to the vampire, knows they're a vampire, knows that they're dangerous. I love Louis and Lestat in the new Interview with the Vampire series. Just blows my mind how well it's adapted. Just like that particular danger trope is one of my absolute favorites. That dangerous attraction and that forbidden attraction. Um, I can't get enough of it, especially uh, when it's queer. obviously.
Yep.
Um,
Yep. Yep.
but particularly when it's queer, but in general, I just can't look away. It's a disaster, train wreck, delight. I need it.
Yep.
So for me, I'll use a turn of phrase that I don't know entirely if I'm using it correctly, if it's used to describe other things, whatever, but I think of it as rage against the dying of the light. So any
Okay.
kind of a time, any time in a story that it seems, or whether even there is, no hope, no chance whatsoever, but still the characters, for its own sake, find it within themselves to resist in some way, to fight back in some way. I find a great deal of inspiration in that personally. I felt like the best example that always comes to my mind, although I'm sure there are much more iconic and important examples out there, more meaningful, in a movie called The Ritual. Basically, four guys go in a woods. There's a whole bunch of other like meaning behind it, but TLDR, there's a monster and there's a ritual about the monster. Turns out, there's a scene where all of his friends are dead. There's no hope, right? But there are a few iconic moments where he just resorts to, right, well, I can't like save myself necessarily, but I can mess all of this stuff up. Whatever it is that's going on, it's not good. I can at least do that, right? And that's what they do. Is any kind of any kind of like last stand media. I do like military reenactment, for example. So the people who wear the silly costumes and run around in the woods and pretend to shoot at each other and whatnot. I always like being on the losing side because there's always that like desperate last minute, we're resisting against the invader. Like that kind of mentality is a fascinating thing to look into.
The Last Stand is always really fun. Speaking of tropes, AI is such a hot topic for a variety of reasons. How do you think AI affects the discussion around classic and modern horror? And I think we answered a lot of this earlier. But do you want to give a quick recap, Rina and Brendan? I'll let Rina go first.
Mm. Well, essentially, it interferes with what we know to be real and what we know to be fake because you can deep fake so many things. And also, AI can create its own kind of horrors with all the weird extra hands and plugs that don't go anywhere and all the weird artifacts that you get in AI art. But it affects our ability to take in information and to sort out what information is real and what information is fake. What is something that we should be aware of versus this is something that's just made up. Like we've all seen the stories of Google AI's overview coming up with the most ridiculous, nonsensical, bonkers things, and it really
In the
affects.
ocean to recharge the eels.
Yes, and it mm, mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Let Rina finish.
And it just changes how we interact with information and how we absorb that information, and it also adds a bajillion trillion tons of information on top of the stuff we already have, which makes the information age a lot more horrific and difficult to navigate in horror.
Brendan, go ahead.
Oh no, that was really the only, just to accentuate on the point. It's the exact same thing. I wasn't trying to go off on a
No,
new
you're good.
tangent.
You're good. You're good. I'm just trying to keep us on schedule because we have about 10 minutes left. And Basil, don't worry about joining late. It's totally fine. I am just mentioning it to our panelists because it was something we had covered earlier. So just catching them up. Also, like AI being so dumb.
Yeah.
It's very sad.
Mm-hmm.
So sad. Oh, I want my Skynet.
Oh, that's the thing. Every time I see someone saying like, "Oh no, we don't have to worry about AI at all because look at how silly it is," it's like it was a whole lot sillier a year ago though, and now it's a lot
Yeah,
less silly now. It's ramping up.
yeah. Maybe I will get my computer daddy someday.
Computer daddy.
Speaking of computer daddy, um, so to finish out, I have our banger question. It took me a minute to think of this, and this is mostly to give both my panelists an aneurysm. Is Frankenstein the doctor, the monster, both, or neither? Please discuss.
Both.
Both.
Okay, good. I'm glad we all established that. Yeah.
It depends on how you define monster, you know?
Mhm.
Depends on how you define
See,
doctor.
That too, I suppose.
well, I mean, clearly, Frankenstein is the monster. The doctor Frankenstein is the monster uh, because of what he does to the thing he creates, the way he approaches it without feeling, the way he shows no emotion, the way he doesn't show any care for the thing that he's created, and just essentially turns it loose. And this thinking, feeling being that he created. But I think also the creature is a monster in a way, not because it's reanimated body parts, but because of how it acts. It learned in a certain way, but it also learned good things, and it made a choice about what to do with those good things. It made the moral choice, and the moral choice was to go murder a bunch of people. And so I think I obviously have a lot more sympathy with the creature than I do with Dr. Victor Frankenstein, who can go fuck himself. And so on. But the creature is also a monster in a lot of ways because it had choices, it had informed behaviors, and it chose the wrong thing in a lot of circumstances. So that is my hill, and I will die on it.
Okay.
I had a thought though. You know what? I agree 100% with everything you said, and that's what I was willing to argue as well. But if you want to look at it as neither of them are the monster, because we can use the word. Unfortunately, I see this all the time in historical conversations. Is we find a figure that we don't like for whatever reason, entirely legitimate reasons, oftentimes, and we label, oh, they're not human, they're a monster. And all of a sudden, because they're not human, we can do whatever we want to them, right? Because they don't really count. Dr. Frankenstein was a monstrous individual in many ways, and yet still at the end of the day was literally human. And even if we do not justify all the things that these agents do, we can explain them, we can understand them. And oftentimes the reason why people do evil things is it's sad, right? There's evil has been done to them, there's evil in their past, whatever it is, they are still human, and that they are capable of doing evil is a tragedy as much as anything else. And so in that way, it's that he was very much human, and that's what makes it all the more sad, because if he was really a monster, it would be in his nature to do evil. But as a human, it's not, right? And the same exact thing with Frankenstein. As a thinking, breathing, aware entity of some sort, okay, maybe not, scientifically, anatomically human or whatever, but still a living being which has made moral choices. And so in that it made arguably the wrong choices, for whatever reason, it's sad, right? There's a tragedy involved in that. And that's not monstrous at all. Something like that. Half-baked idea, but there's something there.
I just think it's interesting that we're referring to Victor Frankenstein as he and Adam as it, because we're inherently monstering Adam. Because we still can't think of him as being human. And in my view, he's a baby. He's been given a life. He might, depending on how we think of the brain and the soul, which we've been discussing earlier, he may have past memories, or he's tabula rasa. So I like the idea that they are both monstered individuals, but I also like the idea that neither of them is the monster. Neither of them is the monster, but both of them are monstered individuals, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
All right, well, we have 5 minutes left, so I would love for you to tell our lovely audience where they can find you. Rina, if you want to start, go ahead, reintroduce yourselves, tell people where they can find you, what you do. Tell them an interesting fact about you that we didn't cover in the panel, if you like.
So I've been Rina Haenze. My pronouns are they, them. And I am the head of Mythos for the Old Ways podcast, where I run Call of Cthulhu, Cthulhu Dark, and various other things with far too many tentacles, eyes, teeth, and deep, dark starless voids. I also show up on a bunch of other APs, including Ain't Slayed Nobody, How We Roll, and Symphony Entertainment. I write for Call of Cthulhu and Cthulhu Dark. You can find my scenarios on DriveThruRPG. One of them is a gold bestseller, Saturday the 14th, actually, which is a slasher homage, follow up to Friday the 13th. And you can find me just about anywhere on Blue Sky, Discord, including the Illusion Horror Discord. I love to chat about horror, my scenarios, Call of Cthulhu, just about anything horror related, really. And you can also mostly find me on Blue Sky. I left the other place a long, long time ago. But you can also find me on Instagram, where I post pictures of my cat and a lot of gay things. Interesting factoid: I've had brain surgery twice, and it gave me a lot of fodder for writing horror stories. So it explains a lot about me.
All right, Brandon.
Yeah. Well, my name is Brandon Fischella. I am a historian by trade. If you are so inclined to find my own work, YouTube, Brandon F on YouTube, because I'm not very creative with my naming conventions. And then my website is nativeoak.org. Thank you both for putting up with me being on the show and everything. This isn't really my usual focus, but I hope that I brought a few interesting ideas to the table all the same. For whatever it is worth, to anyone who's listening, my primary focus with military history really is on the human element of it. I don't care when General Washington ordered the 5th Brigade up the hill and they were using the 35 caliber, not the 37 caliber. I don't care. I really don't care. Don't tell me about that. Tell me about the person who's actually carrying the gun and what they were thinking about what they were doing and why they were doing it and whatnot. And to that end, actually, I very recently was the editor and a contributor for a book I've published called Something Like Philosophy, which is an anthology book, different articles by different authors, all around themes of privation, of horror, of trauma and suffering throughout military history. And the entire point behind these different articles is to draw connections across history so that we can better get a sense for the major themes, right, of what's going on. So they range, for example, all the way from the experiences of a common British soldier during the American War of Independence and the things that he had to deal with and how he thought about the way he was dealing with those things, all the way up to the way that the technology of Second World War strategic bombers were impacting the men who were operating those pieces of equipment. So yeah, my primary focus is absolutely on the individuals, not on the strategies, as it were. Brandon F on YouTube and nativeoak.org. Thank you again.
Excellent. And I have been Jacqueline Bryk. My pronouns are she, they, they. I am an award-winning writer, editor, designer, verber of things in the tabletop and RPG spaces. To tabletop designers, I'm a LARP designer. To LARP designers, I am a tabletop designer. You can find me most places on the internet as Rufflejacks. I do still have a Twitter, but I don't update it regularly because of Elon Musk, who snubbed me at a party once in 2013, and I have never let him live it down. Fun fact about me. But you can find me on Blue Sky, where I've been posting about PAX Unplugged and IllusionCon all weekend. You can find my Linktree at linktree.com/rufflejacks. I am the English language editor for Cult Divinity Lost, which is one of the sponsors of IllusionCon, so please go check that out. I love Delta Green. I'm currently competing in the Delta Green Shotgun Scenario Contest. Very exciting. But thank you so much for joining us for this panel. We have, I think, a couple more panels this weekend, so please go check those out. But I'm going to let our lovely technology guy, Ryan, throw us to the outro video, and we will see you all either very soon or next year or never. It really depends. It's almost 1 a.m. I want to go to bed. Good night.